Hello my friend, I'm Kiddo and today I'm going to be going through the master guide to the Australian vintage t-shirt tags. So the story with this one is I actually wrote and published this article back in December of 2020. Now since then, luckily I haven't had to do too many updates, but in this video today I thought I would just go through some of the key points. So the story with this guide is I had come across a massive haul of tees on Facebook Marketplace. And I realized that I had a lot of tees that covered a lot of the years, but I didn't have enough to finish the guide. So what I decided to do was hold off selling any tees and essentially began collecting more and more of these tees in order to finish this guide, specifically for ACME and Top Heavy. I will say it was definitely a labor of love. It took me way longer than I expected, purely because I needed to get the specific years of the t-shirts. And the other thing was just verifying all the information. Like, I didn't want to publish something that was off. I wanted to get it as on point as possible. I mean, even in the guide itself, in the images, I literally put an overlay that says, use this as a rough guide only, but I really did my best to get it pretty spot on. I've been fortunate over the years to benefit from this article being out there, and I thought it would just be cool for me to come back, revisit this article, and also go through some of the key points from this article, turn it into video form, so that new people who are maybe unfamiliar with this or have never seen this before from me are able to also benefit from the information. Here we are in the article itself. One of my key takeaways early on was understanding the polyester blends and understanding the crossover between, a 65-35 or a 50-50. Meaning, 50-50 polyester cotton, 65-35 meaning, polyester cotton but with more polyester in the blend. Whenever I saw these blends, it immediately taught me, or something that I noticed over time, was that these blends were indicative of t-shirts from the 80s. The key characteristics of these t-shirts were, the ringers, where they have kind of the banding around the arm and a banding around the neckline, but also just the texture of the tee. They were that sticky polyester, and generally these t-shirts were the ones that were smaller in sizing due to age. The other part that was fascinating to me, and something I didn't actually know, was the change of the phone numbers post 1996 in Australia. So I was going through these tags and I noticed some of the tags had phone numbers which had only had 7 digits on them. And this detail stuck out to me big time. So I did more research into the phone numbers, and supposedly, around 1996, we were operating in Australia on a 7-digit phone number, and then post 1996, we shifted to an 8-digit phone number. If you are looking at a Australian vintage t-shirt and you see a t-shirt with a 7-digit phone number, then chances are it's pre-1996. In the process of compiling this guide, I used the polyester cotton blend ratio as a leading indicator, and I also used the phone number on the tag as a leading indicator of whether the Australian t-shirt was a vintage t-shirt or not. Scrolling down now, I began the guide with ACME tags, and I actually released a ACME Instagram post first, and then later on the Top Heavy followed. But when I released the master guide, I put them together and I put them all in one spot. So the interesting part about the ACME tag guide for me was actually compiling and looking at the different textures of the tag itself. So 1989, 1990, you've got the silk tags. Then 1991, you shift to this paper-ish texture tag. And then 1992, it has a specific red Australia tag, which you don't see later on. The most common tag that people will recognize is the red A, but there were so many red A variations that I learned from doing this guide, and that's why I enjoyed documenting it in this way. Another interesting insight is actually the 1993-1994, the black squares. So before I put out this guide, there was a lot of talk of whether these black square or the black rectangle guides were legitimate or not. Some people thought they might be fakes or fake vintage, but I was clearly able to source some and cross-reference and confirm that in fact the black rectangle tags were legitimate and genuine. There's multiple variations of it. One has a made in Australia and one also has a made in China, and the 100% cotton tag is to the side of the main tag. Another interesting detail in this guide was the concept of the double tagging. So you have situations where, you have a double tag and the under tag is a paper tag and the top tag is, your normal texture. The other part of this as well is the blue grape in the mid 90s to 2000. So ACME had the licensing and were able to do, blue grape tags, but the underneath showed that it was ACME merchandising in Sydney. So it was this kind of crossover licensing deal that ACME were able to secure. One specific detail that surprised me was actually cross-referencing the 1993 tag being made in China but printed in Australia. And this was one of the first variations of the red ACME tag. And this specific tag with the 100% cotton, made in China, printed in Australia, red A single tag, belonged to the Nirvana heart-shaped box ACME variation. So it's very interesting to see the made in China pop up first before the made in Australia red ACME tags. This was an interesting detail that caught me off guard, because obviously after that there was more made in China tags, but there was also made in Australia tags after that first variation. As you can see, kind of Y2K, the ACME tag then changes around 2001, 2002 to the black square. And what was really cool was actually seeing the Sydney 2000 ACME sponsored tag as well. This is the ACME tag timeline. The reason why I didn't just do, the tag guide as everybody else does, was this ACME tag timeline actually includes some tags from the late 80s. So those ones are slightly different texture as well. They're not just silk. Some of those were actually a cotton material towards the late 80s. So seeing those super old tags that were less synthetic and still printed on was very fascinating to me. As I scroll down here, you'll be able to see all the tags that I used to substantiate the evidence that I provided in the tag guide. The real reason why I wanted to do this is I wanted to just give people more confidence that the tag guide wasn't just made up, that the tag guide wasn't just estimated. I wanted to make sure that not only did I get the teas, but I also showed the teas that I used to create the guide itself. I then extended it to further detail, outlining, the example t-shirt that I used, the tag type, the tag qualities, the phone number on the tag, where it was made, and then also the stitching, so whether it was single stitch or double stitch. There was actually a lot of misconceptions about whether a double stitch ACME belonged to a certain year. So what I noticed was that first variation of the Nirvana heart-shaped box on the ACME tag was actually a double stitch heart-shaped box. So compiling these details I found to be extremely important to just add to the legitimacy of the entire article itself. And I felt like that was just a great way for me to verify and kind of get the years closer to exact. Now, obviously, because I didn't work with ACME, because I didn't work with Top Heavy, I can't 100% confirm the legitimacy of every single detail. And nor do I think that one of the founders could either. There are so many little nuanced details that are in this guide that I just felt like, okay, let me just document this. Here was an interesting observation. It was actually the Brockum tag. So there was a Brockum tag here that was licensed by ACME. And as you can see on the underside of the tag, it was made in Australia. What's interesting is there is actually a lot of fake variations of this specific tag, but I don't think there is any fake variations of the Brockum front tag with the back of the tag showing the made in Australia. So there was some questions about the legitimacy of Brockum made in Australia, but I was able to confirm that they were in fact legit, at least at the time of this writing. Maybe somebody has made more fakes, but this was a very interesting observation to have made, which is the Brockum made in Australia and licensed to ACME Merchandising, Sydney, Australia. As I scroll down now here, I had found one article that I could kind of quote from about Blaine and how he started ACME. And then as I moved on to, learning the licenses, I put that in there as well. Next was to move on to the Top Heavy tags. So Top Heavy, a couple interesting details here was, as you can see, the 7-digit phone number then being removed from the tags altogether. The 1991 version is the paper tag, and before 1991, the Top Heavy has paper tags. Once it goes into 1991-92, that's when you get, the paint splatter Top Heavy logo, but on, a fabric tag. And the interesting variation between 94 and 95 is actually the gap spacing between the Top Heavy logo and the 100% cotton spell out. And then, as it transitions, the 100% cotton and the Top Heavy logo actually physically come closer together. Then after 1994, you know, circa 97 as well, you get these other variations of like a bronze text top heavy and then also a silver text top heavy. Embellishment details in the font have changed color. Then I documented, you know, the top heavy tag timeline where I put them in a rough guide to the years as well. The final part of this guide that I wanted to work on was actually just the rough tags that I had. So the singular tags of Australian vintage tees, which weren't necessarily, you know, desirable tees. They weren't necessarily popular tees, but I noticed just by collecting the tags that I was able to spot certain details and just witness the sheer amount of mom and pop manufacturers that were making tees in Australia during that period. And so it was really fascinating to kind of collect all of these super niche tees, some of which I already had, obviously, collect these tees, put them all into the guide. And this was the Aussie Tags first edition that I released, which also features, you know, Australian tour merchandising, which was ATM. It's got Aussie t-shirts. It's got the Lisa tag. There's also a double Lisa tag as well. The Nice Man, which is slightly more common, but also rare. And then as I scroll down as well to the part 2 of more 80s and 90s vintage t-shirt tags. So look, there was so much variation with these tags, but a lot of the common themes that I saw were the older tags are usually paper textured. And if they're not paper textured, then they're probably silk textured. If anything was made in Australia, it was likely to be vintage. And then there was obviously the topic of the phone numbers. So if the phone number was a 7-digit phone number, then chances are it was before 1996, and the t-shirt it was on was probably vintage. Something I started to pay attention to as well is whether a t-shirt tag had a double tag or not, and even the variation between the two tags would help me to understand whether it was vintage or not. So I guess the biggest thing I learned from releasing this guide and all the work that went into it was just the importance of, you know, double research, the importance of going over my work more than once. I realized that if I didn't put the effort in to compile all of this information, I don't know whether this guide would have come out. I don't know whether somebody else would have made this guide. It was the perfect storm of me having the teas, but also just being willing in that chapter of my life to create something like this, which I knew would take a lot of time. I just didn't fully anticipate how much effort I would have to put in to compile it all, and also just to double check that it was correct. The main thing putting this guide together was making sure that I got everything right, rather than, you know, putting out this half-baked guide. I've heard from a lot of people that they still use this guide, and that was really my hope when I first published this, that it would be valuable for years to come. And I hope even now that it's valuable. That was really my goal. An unexpected benefit of putting this guide out was actually some of the connections I made within the Australian vintage community. It was also, you know, the ability to have those conversations with people who were interested in this niche of a niche thing that I was interested in. And so this article really proved to be a super networking tool, because even if people didn't know me, they at least knew the guide itself, and they at least knew, you know, my logo from the guide. And so what that proved to me was that the effort that I put in was well worth it. What this tag guide doesn't include is the TSP and the East Coast tags. From my knowledge, the TSP, if I had to guess, is like mid-90s to early Y2K. There is, fascinatingly enough, a paper tag I think that belongs in the early 2000s. Important thing to note as well is that a lot of the Silverchair tags towards the late 90s were on those TSP tags. So I guess just to close out, thank you very much if you made it this far. This was the review of the Master Guide to Australian Vintage T-shirt tags that I released, you know, back in 2020. I hope that if you've used this guide, that it brought you value. I hope that if you're yet to see this guide, I will leave a link in the description below so that you can go check it out. It has a lot of information about ACME and Top Heavy, and also includes some of the other Australian vintage t-shirt tags which you would have seen earlier in the video. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Kiddo, and I'll see you on the next one.